The rain had been falling since dawn, soft but relentless, washing the glass towers of downtown Chicago in a gray blur. Inside the 38th floor of Hawthorne Industries, the air felt heavier than the weather outside. Richard Hawthorne stood alone in his corner office, staring at the city he once ruled with confidence. At 46, he was a self-made millionaire, the kind business magazines loved to put on their cover: sharp suit, sharp mind, sharper ambition. But today, none of that mattered. His company was bleeding. Investors were pulling out. The board was circling like vultures, and in less than 30 days, Hawthorne Industries could collapse. On his desk lay a single folder. Marked in red, Final Audit Review. Richard hadn't opened it yet. He already knew what it would say. Years of unchecked expansion, a few bad partnerships, and one disastrous overseas contract had pushed the company to the edge. The worst part wasn't losing money, it was losing control. For the first time in his life, Richard Hawthorne didn't have the answers. Across the city, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, Aaliyah Carter tightened the laces on her worn sneakers and checked the time on her cracked phone screen. 23, that's how old she was. Too young, people said, to carry the weight she carried. She had grown up watching her mother work double shifts, watching bills pile higher than dreams. But Aaliyah had always been different. Numbers spoke to her in a way people never did. Patterns, systems, quiet logic, she understood them instinctively. That morning, she clutched a printed email invitation like it was fragile glass. It was for a temporary consulting role at Hawthorne Industries. Unpaid for the first month? Experience opportunity, the email had said. Most people would have laughed and deleted it. Aaliyah didn't. She had spent the last 3 nights studying the company public filings. Market behavior, customer churn data, even employee reviews buried deep in forums. Something about Hawthorne Industries didn't add up, and she was certain the problem wasn't just bad luck. She arrived at the building 15 minutes early, standing in the massive marble lobby that smelled like money and polish. People in tailored suits passed her without a second glance. She adjusted her thrift store blazer and lifted her chin. She had learned long ago that if you walked like you belonged somewhere, people hesitated to challenge you. When Aaliyah finally stepped into the conference room, she felt the shift instantly. The table was long, glossy, intimidating. 5 executives sat on one side, all older, all white, all already exhausted. At the head of the table sat Richard Hawthorne himself. He barely looked up when she entered. Next, one of the executives muttered. Aaliyah cleared her throat. "Good morning. I'm Aaliyah Carter." Richard glanced up then, his eyes briefly scanning her from head to toe before flicking back to his notes. "You're the intern?" "Consultant," she corrected gently. "Temporary. I specialize in data analysis and operational restructuring." A faint smirk crossed one executive's face. Another checked his watch. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Miss Carter, we appreciate your interest, but I don't think you understand the scale of what we're dealing with here." Aaliyah didn't flinch. "With respect, sir, I think I do. Your logistics division is losing money not because demand is down, but because your pricing algorithm hasn't been updated to reflect regional supply delays. You're over-discounting in high-demand zones and underservicing emerging markets." The room went quiet. Richard's pen froze mid-air. "That's, not possible. Our analytics team is relying on last year's assumptions," Aaliyah finished. "And they're wrong?" One executive scoffed. "You expect us to believe you figured this out from the outside?" Aaliyah reached into her bag and pulled out a slim notebook. "I ran simulations using publicly available data and industry benchmarks. Your losses started the same quarter you outsourced regional forecasting. The numbers match almost perfectly." Richard stood slowly, walking toward her. For the first time in weeks, something stirred inside him, not hope, exactly, but curiosity. "If you're right," he said quietly, "why hasn't anyone here seen it?" Aaliyah met his gaze. "Because sometimes people stop listening to the data when it challenges their pride." The words hit harder than anyone expected. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Richard exhaled sharply and turned to his team. "Leave us. There was hesitation, but one by one they filed out. When the door closed, silence filled the room again. Richard studied her. You realize what you're suggesting could cost people their jobs? Aaliyah nodded. I also realize not fixing it will cost everyone their jobs. He walked back to his chair and sat down slowly. You don't look like someone who's had doors opened for her. I haven't, she replied. That's why I learned how to open them myself. For the next 2 hours they talked. Really talked. About margins, broken systems, wasted talent. Aaliyah spoke with clarity and restraint, never once raising her voice. Richard listened more than he had in years. By the time the conversation ended, the rain outside had stopped. You're staying. Richard said finally. Aaliyah blinked. I thought this was unpaid for. You'll be paid, he interrupted. And you'll report directly to me? She hesitated. People here won't like that. A shadow crossed his face. People here haven't saved this company. As Aaliyah stepped back into the elevator later that day, her hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what she'd just accepted. She wasn't just stepping into a company in crisis. She was stepping into a world that had never been built for someone like her. Up in his office, Richard opened the red folder for the first time. But instead of dread, there was something new in his chest, a fragile, dangerous thing called possibility. Neither of them knew it yet. But the fate of Hawthorne Industries now rested in the hands of a young black woman no one had seen coming, and this was only the beginning. The next morning, Aaliyah arrived before sunrise. The building was quiet, almost peaceful, nothing like the tense battlefield it became after 9 o'clock. She sat alone in the analytics department, screens glowing as she pulled real-time data feeds and historical reports side by side. The deeper she went, the clearer the truth became. The company wasn't just mismanaged, it was being quietly drained. By the time executives began filing in, Aaliyah had mapped 3 years of financial leakage to a single vendor chain tied to a subsidiary no one ever questioned. Every invoice was technically legal, every contract properly signed. But together they told a story of intentional inefficiency. Someone was profiting from Hawthorne Industries losing money. Richard stood behind her without announcing himself. You didn't go home, he said. She shook her head. I couldn't. The numbers kept talking. He studied the screen, his jaw tightening as understanding settled in. This division is overseen by Marcus Bell, he said. He's been with me since the beginning. That's why no one looked closely, Aaliyah replied. Trust can become camouflage. Richard leaned on the desk, suddenly looking older than his years. If you're right, exposing this will shake everything. Aaliyah turned to face him. Saving this company doesn't just mean fixing systems. It means choosing truth over loyalty. Later that day, whispers followed her through the halls. She felt eyes on her back, heard her name spoken in lowered voices. Some dismissed her as a gamble. Others saw her as a threat. In the boardroom, Marcus Bell smiled too easily when introduced to her, his handshake lingering a second too long. You must be the miracle, he said. Aaliyah met his smile with calm precision. I prefer facts. That night, as Richard stood alone once more in his office, he realized something that unsettled him more than bankruptcy ever had. For years, he had believed power came from control. But watching Aaliyah move through his company with quiet certainty, he understood the truth far too late. Power came from insight. And the woman everyone underestimated had both insight and courage to burn the lies to the ground. As the days passed, pressure tightened around them like a closing fist. Emergency meetings filled the calendar, and every recommendation Aaliyah made was questioned twice as hard as the last. Still, she didn't retreat. She came prepared, armed with charts, projections, and evidence that refused to be ignored. When voices rose, she stayed calm. When egos clashed, she stayed focused. Richard watched from the head of the table, noticing how the room slowly changed. Executives who once dismissed her began to pause before speaking. Some avoided her eyes altogether. Others leaned in, realizing too late that she wasn't guessing, she was exposing. One evening, as the building emptied, Aaliyah stood by the window overlooking the city lights. Richard joined her in silence. They're scared, he finally said. They should be, she replied softly. Fear means the truth is close. Richard nodded, understanding now that saving his company would cost more than money. It would cost comfort, alliances, and illusions. And somewhere deep inside the machine he built, the countdown had already begun. By the second week, Hawthorne Industries no longer felt like a company in crisis. It felt like a company at war with itself. Meetings stretched longer, voices grew sharper, and trust thinned with every passing hour. Aaliyah could feel it the moment she stepped off the elevator each morning, the resistance. Quiet but heavy, settling into the air like smoke. The board called an emergency session without notifying her. Richard found out only minutes before it began. When he entered the room, the tension was already coiled tight. Marcus Bell sat near the center of the table, composed, confident. His hands folded as if he had nothing to fear. We can't keep letting an untested consultant dictate company direction, one board member said flatly. The stock has dipped again. Richard's voice was controlled. The stock dipped because the market is reacting to uncertainty. The solutions she proposed haven't even been implemented yet. Marcus leaned forward, his tone smooth. With respect, Richard, perception matters. Investors don't see innovation. They see instability. And frankly, this experiment looks reckless. Aaliyah stood just outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She had arrived early as always, but stopped when she heard her name being dissected like a liability. For a moment, doubt crept in. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked in anyway. If we're going to talk about me, she said calmly, I'd like to be present. Silence snapped across the room. Marcus offered a polite smile. Of course, please enlighten us. Aaliyah connected her tablet to the screen without asking permission. Graphs bloomed across the wall, clean, undeniable. The stock dip began 48 hours after rumors spread about internal disagreement, she said. Not after my proposals. Instability doesn't come from change. It comes from fear of exposure. One board member scoffed. Exposure to what, exactly? To inefficiency masked as loyalty, Aaliyah replied. Richard felt the shift immediately. This wasn't just analysis anymore. This was confrontation. Over the next hour, Aaliyah dismantled years of false confidence with quiet precision. She showed how decisions were delayed in the name of tradition, how contracts were renewed without review, how talent was ignored because it didn't look familiar. Each slide tightened the room further. Marcus finally interrupted. You're suggesting people here acted in bad faith. I'm suggesting, Aaliyah said evenly, that good faith without accountability is dangerous. When the meeting ended, no one spoke. Not to her. Not to each other. The board adjourned without a vote. Later that afternoon, Aaliyah found her access to 2 major databases revoked. IT claimed it was a system update. She knew better. Richard slammed his office door shut. They're trying to freeze you out? She nodded, which means we're close. That night, she worked from printed reports and backup files she'd quietly saved days earlier. Patterns emerged faster now. One name appeared again and again, Marcus Bell, tied to decisions that bled the company while protecting a select few. When Richard arrived the next morning, Aaliyah didn't greet him. She simply handed him a folder. What's this? He asked. The truth, she said. And it's going to hurt. Inside were timelines, signatures, offshore transfers carefully buried under layers of approval. Nothing illegal on its own. Devastating in totality. Richard sank into his chair. He was my first partner, he whispered. He believed in me when no one else did. Aaliyah's voice softened but didn't bend. Sometimes the people who help you build something are the same ones who won't let it grow. Outside the office, the company buzzed with rumor and fear. Inside, Richard Hawthorne faced the hardest decision of his life: protect the man who stood beside him at the beginning, or protect the company's future now. Resting on the courage of a young black woman who refused to stay. Silent, and as the city lights flickered on below, Aaliyah knew one thing with certainty: the storm wasn't over. It was just learning how to speak. Asterisk. The following days unfolded like a slow-burning fire. Marcus didn't confront them directly at first. He didn't have to. Subtlety was his weapon. Anonymous leaks reached financial blogs questioning Richard's leadership. An article hinted that Hawthorne Industries had handed strategic control to an inexperienced outsider. The description was careful, coded, but unmistakable. Aaliyah saw it circulating on phones in the elevator, in whispered conversations near the coffee machines, in glances that lingered a second too long. By midweek, her name had become a dividing line. Some employees avoided her entirely, afraid proximity might cost them their jobs. Others watched her with a quiet, desperate hope, as if she were proof that the system could still be challenged. Aaliyah noticed both, but responded to neither. She kept working. Late one night, while running a deep comparison of vendor pricing models, her screen froze, then went black. When it rebooted, entire folders were gone. Months of internal logs erased. She sat very still, hands resting on the keyboard, heart steady, despite the warning pounding in her chest. This wasn't coincidence. This was retaliation. She didn't panic. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. Redundancy wasn't paranoia. It was survival. The next morning, Marcus made his move. An all-hands meeting was called. The auditorium filled quickly, tension humming beneath forced smiles. Richard stood at the podium, his expression unreadable. Marcus sat beside him, calm, confident, already victorious in his mind. Marcus spoke first. "Change is necessary," he said smoothly. "But chaos is not. Our company has thrived on stability, on trust, on knowing who we are." His eyes flicked briefly toward Alia in the third row. "There have been recommendations," he continued, "that risk undermining that foundation." Murmurs rippled through the room. Aaliyah felt heat rise, but she stayed seated. This was exactly what Marcus wanted, a reaction without proof. He wanted to frame her as disruption itself. Richard's turn came. He paused longer than usual before speaking. "Truth can feel like chaos when we've grown comfortable with silence," he said. Marcus stiffened. Richard continued, "This company is in danger not because someone questioned it, but because too few people did." Aaliyah looked up, meeting his eyes. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw resolve instead of doubt. Marcus stood abruptly. "Are you accusing me?" he asked, voice sharp now. "I'm inviting transparency," Richard replied. Aaliyah rose slowly. Every eye turned to her. "I didn't come here to take power," she said evenly. "I came here because the data showed people were being hurt, employees laid off, departments stripped, futures quietly sold. If defending that makes me a threat, then so be it." A man in the crowd shouted, "Who even are you?" Aaliyah didn't flinch. "I'm someone who listened when the numbers were screaming." She connected her device to the main screen. The room fell silent as charts, timelines, and transactions appeared, names, dates, patterns too consistent to dismiss. The air shifted from doubt to shock. Marcus laughed once, sharp and hollow. "This is interpretation," he said. "Not proof." "It's consequence," Aaliyah replied. "And it's traceable." Security moved closer, unsure who they were meant to protect. Richard stepped forward. "This ends now," he said. "An independent investigation begins today." Marcus's mask finally cracked. "You'll destroy everything we built," he snapped. "No," Richard said quietly. "We'll finally know what it cost." As the meeting dissolved into stunned silence, Aaliyah felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She knew what would come next: legal threats, character attacks, isolation. But she also knew something else. The truth was no longer buried. And once uncovered, it had a way of demanding justice. Outside, the city moved as it always had, unaware that inside one glass tower, power had shifted not through force or wealth, but through courage, clarity, and the refusal of a young black woman to be a race asterisk in the hours that followed. The building felt different, quieter, heavier. Conversations stopped when Aaliyah passed. Not from hostility now, but from uncertainty. People were recalculating what they thought they knew, who they trusted, and where they stood. Some sent her brief messages of support, unsigned but sincere. Others watched from a distance, waiting to see if she would survive the fallout. Richard called her into his office just before dusk. The city glowed orange behind him. "They'll come for you," he said honestly. "They already have," Aliyah replied. "What matters is whether you stand firm." He nodded. "I will. Even if it costs me everything?" Aliyah allowed herself a small breath. For the first time since she'd walked into Hawthorne Industries, she felt something close to safety. But as she stepped back into the hallway, her phone buzzed with a single unknown message. "You should have stayed invisible." She didn't delete it. She saved it. Because she knew the fight wasn't over. It was only changing shape. The investigation began quietly, but its presence was felt everywhere. Lawyers moved through Hawthorne Industries like shadows, requesting files, conducting interviews, asking questions no one had ever dared to ask out loud. The board tried to project calm to the outside world, but inside the company, fear settled deep. People spoke in half sentences. Emails were rewritten 3 times before being sent. Every decision felt like it might later be used as evidence. For Aliyah, the pressure intensified. Her name appeared in opinion pieces questioning her credibility. Anonymous sources accused her of manipulation, ambition disguised as ethics. Someone leaked photos from her childhood neighborhood, framing her story as a calculated narrative rather than a lived reality. She read none of it aloud, but she felt it all. At night, sleep came in fragments. Still, every morning she showed up. Marcus Bell did not go quietly. He filed an internal complaint accusing Aliyah of data tampering. He claimed Richard had been misled, emotionally compromised by guilt and ego. He moved confidently like a man who had spent decades mastering rooms and people. But this time, the ground beneath him was unstable. During a closed-door session with investigators, Aliyah laid everything out. She didn't embellish. She didn't plead. She simply walked them through the data, step by step, letting the truth speak without interruption. When they asked why she stayed, knowing the cost, she answered plainly. "Because if I walked away," she said, "this would keep happening. Maybe not here, but somewhere else." Richard watched from the far end of the room, listening as the woman he'd once nearly dismissed carried the weight of his entire company with steady hands. He understood then that leadership wasn't about being the smartest voice in the room. It was about knowing when to step back and let truth lead. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon. An emergency board meeting was called. News outlets had caught wind of the investigation, and the stock hovered dangerously low. Marcus arrived early, confident as ever, dressed impeccably, his expression calm. He took his seat as if nothing had changed. When Richard entered, he didn't sit at the head of the table. He stood. "Before we begin," he said, "there's something you all need to see." The screen lit up. It wasn't a chart. It wasn't a projection. It was an email chain. Years old, archived, forgotten, but unmistakable. Messages detailing deliberate delays, redirected contracts, strategic losses designed to enrich private interests. Marcus's name appeared again and again, not as an accident, not as oversight, but as architect. Silence swallowed the room. Marcus's face tightened. "Context matters," he said sharply. "You're seeing fragments." "No," Richard replied. "We're seeing intent." The lead investigator stood. "Based on our findings, we are recommending immediate suspension pending legal action." Marcus rose, his composure finally cracking. "You owe me," he snapped at Richard. "Without me, there is no Hawthorne Industries." Richard met his gaze. "Without you," he said quietly, "there's a future." Security escorted Marcus out. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. But as he passed Aliyah, his eyes burned with something close to disbelief. Not hatred, fear. When the doors closed behind him, the room exhaled as one. In the days that followed, the truth went public. Headlines shifted. The narrative changed. Hawthorne Industries wasn't collapsing, it was correcting. Investors returned cautiously. Employees who had lived under silent pressure began to speak freely for the first time in years. And Aliyah? She became impossible to ignore. Richard offered her a permanent executive role. Not as a symbol, not as redemption, as recognition. She didn't accept immediately. I need to know this isn't about saving face, she told him. I need to know the system changes, even when I'm gone. Richard nodded. Help me build that system, he said. Then stay or don't on your terms. Together, they restructured everything. Transparency became policy. Oversight was no longer optional. Talent was evaluated on results, not familiarity. Mistakes were documented instead of buried. It was slower, harder, but real. Months later, Hawthorne Industries reported its first genuine growth in years. On a quiet evening, long after the chaos had settled, Aaliyah stood once more by the same window she had stood by on her first week. The city lights stretched endlessly below her, no longer intimidating, just vast. Richard joined her, hands in his pockets. You changed this place, he said. She shook her head. I revealed it. He smiled faintly. What will you do now? Aaliyah thought of her mother, of late nights and unpaid labor, of brilliance overlooked because it didn't arrive wrapped in privilege. I'll build, she said, and I'll make sure doors don't close behind me. She left Hawthorne Industries not with applause, but with impact. Offers flooded in. Speaking invitations? Advisory roles. She chose carefully, deliberately. Her power wasn't in being everywhere. It was in being effective. Years later, business students would study the Hawthorne turnaround. They would analyze strategies, leadership decisions, market corrections. But those who knew the truth understood something deeper. A company wasn't saved by money. It was saved by a young black woman who listened when others refused, who stood when others stayed silent, and who proved that insight, courage, and integrity could shift even the heaviest structures. And somewhere in the city, in a building once ruled by fear, the lights burned steady no longer as a symbol of power alone, but of accountability. The end wasn't quiet. It was earned.